The metaphysic is sometimes described as gradualism. That is to say, everything in existence is to some degree mind, spirit, consciousness. The old notion of degrees of being all up the hierarchy, you see, is now translated into a developmental process. The process of evolution is the development of greater degrees in the graduated process, greater degrees of mind, spirit. This is part of the evolutionary optimism. And for Hegel, the fullest manifestation of spirit comes out in German culture. Where else would you expect? Yeah, this was the age of nationalism. Why? Because what is nationalism? It's the embodiment, the full self-discovery, self-realization of the identity of the spirit of a people. Nationalism is a product of Romanticism, a product of this German idealism.
I'm comparing myself with Hegel, but at least at some level we have something in common. Are people aware that when Phenomenologie des Geistes, Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's masterpiece, when it first appeared, it was dismissed by many critics as a totally confused work where Hegel jumps from one to another example, mixing culture, religion, history, philosophical, logical, psychological, scientific ideas and so on, as a totally confused mixture and so on. So there is already something of jumping from one example to the other in Hegel's Denkweise, in Hegel's way of thinking. In this sense, I don't think that bringing aliens into it is really to bring in something strange to Hegel. Hegel is the big alien of modern philosophy, literally. I mean, it's almost a doxa of contemporary philosophy from 19th century onwards to define yourself through a distance towards Hegel. It's as if we are still all post-Hegelians, in the sense that all versions of modern philosophy are some kind of reversal of Hegel. Like against Hegel idealism, you emphasize concrete life. Against Hegel rationalism, you emphasize the irrationality of life, whatever. It's almost as if contemporary philosophy is anti-Hegelian, which of course I find suspicious, in the sense that why do we all need Hegel? Why do we build this monster Hegel? So, you know, I would like to make some kind of a reversal where it's not Hegel versus alien, it is Hegel as alien versus our ordinary
historical way, didn't he? He saw them as being embedded in human life, in ways of life, in societies, and as societies change, so the concepts change. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. He saw that there was development in the way history occurred, that it was always moving forward. It was always a process, never static.
And he had a name for the way in which it moved forward. He called this the dialectical process. Now, can you explain exactly what, in Hegel's mind, the dialectical process was?
Let's go back to the example I mentioned before. Greek society he saw as a harmony, but as a simple harmony. A simple harmony in the sense that people had not developed the alternative notion of individual conscience. There was harmony between the individual and society because individuals hadn't really thought about things themselves. Now, into that simple harmony, there came, in the person, in fact, of Socrates, whom Hegel considers a world historical figure, there came the idea of questioning this harmony. Socrates went around asking people, what is justice? What is virtue? And when they tried to answer, they realized that they'd accepted certain conventions which Socrates had no trouble in showing could not be sustained. So the simple harmony of Greek society broke down, and because Socrates broke it down, incidentally, Hegel thinks that the Athenians were quite right to condemn Socrates to death. He was genuinely corrupting and subverting Athenian society. But that was an essential part of a historical process, because ultimately, and Hegel fills in the gaps, the steps, but ultimately that led to the rise of individual conscience, and a second necessary element, and the opposite of Greek society. So we've moved from what Hegel calls the thesis to the antithesis. The antithesis of Greek society is individual conscience risen to its height in Protestant Europe. But that too turns out to be unstable. It leads to the destruction of the French Revolution and the terror that followed the French Revolution. And so that too must give way to a synthesis, to a third stage, which combines harmony and individual conscience. And very often in this process, that then again serves as the new thesis from which a further antithesis will arise and the process will continue.
Now, this notion of dialectical change that you've just explained has been so influential ever since Hegel, and it's enormously influential today through Marxism, which embodies it, that I think we must get it completely clear in our minds. So let me just go over it again. The idea is, isn't it, that Hegel put forward that the reason why we human beings are involved in a process of perpetual change is that every complex situation contains within itself conflicting elements, which therefore destabilize the situation. And therefore the situation cannot go on indefinitely. It breaks down into something else within which those conflicts are dissolved or assuaged. But then, of course, in the new situation, you get new conflicts. And so it goes on indefinitely. So you get, as you put it just now, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which becomes a new thesis using his terminology. And this, Hegelians and following them Marxists think, gives us the key to history, to understanding historical change, the dialectical process.
Now, Emerson was not the founder of the school of Transcendentalism. He simply reflected the ideals and probably was its most articulate spokesman. But Transcendentalism, both the word and the concept, began with Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, and I like to give dates for the academic approach here, 1724 to 1804. Now, let me make one thing clear. And that is, I certainly do not recommend that you read Kant. If you have any interest in that direction and have any background in philosophy, you probably have already stumbled along through Kant. But if you are adventuresome and you have a dictionary that's just aching to be used, then you might read his Critique of Pure Reason. We're taking certain aspects of Kant out of the context of his overall philosophic observation, certainly. And we're dealing with a certain facet of his approach that we feel has touched off the school of Transcendentalism, especially as we like to deal with it in New Thought. But we must recognize that Kant caused an upheaval in the history of human thought. Not only were most of the philosophers of Western Europe and America for 100 years after his death his intellectual descendants, but I think it is obvious that his spirit dominated the culture of the Western world during that time. Now that could be argued, certainly, but I think there would be a great deal of support for it. Now, it's also interesting that the poets of the 19th century, Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats and Tennyson and Browning and some of the American poets, and we would include perhaps Walt Whitman, were to a certain degree the creations of the idealism that was touched off by Kant. And as we have said and we'll deal with tonight, his influence is most strongly seen in Emerson.
Let's see the sky between the walls, hold all of it wonders, and scanty intervals of last society.
Welcome back, Seekers. Today we're diving into one of the most profound minds in Western philosophy, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, Hegel's ideas, although dense for some, are the hidden bedrock behind New Thought's metaphysical foundations. So today we're going to unpack his Dialectic. We'll solve the puzzle of evil in a monastic universe and trace how his absolute spirit, or absolute Geist absolute, quietly shaped unity, science of mind, and daily affirmations. So let's get started. But first, we're going to look at the movement that Hegel belonged to, German Idealism. And after that, we'll explore Hegel's predecessor, Immanuel Kant, and his similarities and disagreements with one of New Thought's predecessors, our favorite 18th century Christian mystic at this channel, Kant Swedenborg. All right, but to begin, what is German idealism? German idealism was a philosophical movement that originated in the late 18th and 19th century Germany. It emerged as a response to Kant's 18th century critical philosophy, and it sought to overcome perceived limitations in Kant's system, particularly the distinction between the knowable world of appearances, which Kant calls phenomena, and the unknowable thing in itself, noumenon. And when we get to Laruelle in the future, we'll talk about how his ideas are related and an engagement with a lot of these ideas. But as by way of overview, let's just quickly talk about the core ideas, core figures, and significance of German idealism. So the primary idea of German idealism is the idea of primacy of mind, which can also be synonymous with spirit or idea. So German idealists argued that reality is fundamentally mental, spiritual, or conceptual. That's the idealism part. Materialists like Marx and others see reality as fundamentally material, on the other hand. Okay, so the physical world to the idealist is not primary, but it's constituted or shaped by mind, consciousness, reason, or spirit, which is in German is called Geist. It's where we get the term ghost from, actually, too. So, but they rejected the idea of a world existing completely independent of mind. You know, a materialist might say that material is independent of mind, and mind is constituted of material. But instead, the idealists saw mind and spirit as the active organizing principle creating or revealing reality. The key goals of German idealism is first to overcome and reconcile Kant's dualistic presumptions. So Kant saw a split between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, or between the subject and object. So we could think of subject as the internal world and object as the external world, right? The subject is the world, the individual is the subject, right? And then the outside, the other, is anything other is object. But the German idealists aim to show how the mind actually actively constructs the worlds it knows, making the thing in itself, the noumena or the object, knowable or even unnecessary in some systems. They also sought to achieve systemic unity, developing comprehensive philosophical systems that explained all of reality. And so we are looking at a lot of systems that are meta-narratives, that are sort of attempts to be theories of everything. Nature, history, knowledge, ethics, art, religion. So all of reality in these categories are manifestations of a single rational principle, according to Hegel, absolute spirit, or the absolute. Another goal was to understand freedom. They wanted to explain human freedom within a seemingly determined universe. So, again, determinism and free will how might they be compatible? How might the idea that we have agency and choice synthesize with a concept of will as existing within natural law and determined systems? The idealists often saw freedom as the ultimate goal or essence of spirit or reason, realizing itself in history. And we'll talk about what that meant to Hegel a little bit more. So, as I mentioned, some major figures were Immanuel Kant. He was sort of the precursor. His Copernican revolution laid the groundwork where objects conform to our mind's structures. German idealism started by grappling with his unresolved tensions. Kant's transcendentalism, or transcendental idealism, asserted the mind's role in structuring reality and indirectly paved the way for New Thought's medical foundations by influencing the transcendentalists like Emerson. Another German idealist was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte argued that the absolute active or ego posits itself and its opposite, the not I. So subjective ego versus the nominal not I, through a process of self-assertion. So reality is a product of absolute subjectivity. He emphasized practical reason, such as ethics and action, as primary. Then another was Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who focused on the identity of mind and nature and argued for an absolute identity, absolute with a capital A. Absolute identity was a neutral ground prior to the subject-object distinction. So we could look at it as unity or spirit or God, manifesting as both nature in the unconscious spirit and mind in the conscious spirit. He also developed a philosophy of nature called nature philosophy. While Schelling's philosophy and New Thought both emphasize themes of unity, mind-body integration, and the power of consciousness, they diverge significantly in scope and method. Schelling's abstract cosmic idealism, which was rooted in German Romanticism and metaphysical inquiry, explores the absolute as a dynamic interplay of mind and nature, often through systemic philosophical action. In contrast, New Thought, though similarly focused on harmonizing inner and outer reality, adopts a pragmatic and individual-centered approach, prioritizing actionable techniques for personal transformation, such as affirmative prayer, visualization, and alignment of thought with material well-being. All right. And finally, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most influential, developed the most comprehensive system where reality is the capital A absolute spirit or idea dialectically unfolding through history. So spirit achieves self-knowledge and freedom through a process of dialectic thesis, antithesis, synthesis, triad. Everything, logic, nature, history, society, art, religion, philosophy, is a stage in this rational dialectical process. Evil and suffering are real, but are ultimately transformed and overcome in the process of spirit through self-realization, increasing towards freedom through synthesis. The German idealists shaped subsequent philosophy, including Marxism, existentialism, pragmatism, and analytic philosophy, theology, political theory, historiography, and art. It represented the peak of an ambitious, all-encompassing philosophical system in Western thought. They deeply emphasized the importance and rationality of history as the process of spirit's development, especially Hegel, the development of the spirit. German idealism, in simple terms, is the belief that reality is not just out there, independent of us, but it's fundamentally shaped, even created by mind, spirit, and rational concepts, ideas. Thinkers like Fichte, Schelling, and especially Hegel built vast systems showing how this single principle of spirit or idea explains everything from the laws of nature to human history and freedom, overcoming the divisions, the dualism of Kant. Hegel and other German idealists came to America and American thought through the Transcendentalists. Figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Bronson Alcott, leader of the utopian Fruitlands community, integrated German idealist ideas into their writings. Emerson's concept of the oversoul, a universal divine consciousness, mirrored Hegelian themes. Transcendentalism's focus on intuition and spiritual immanence influenced New Thought's emphasis on personal connection to a higher power. Emerson was exposed to German idealism primarily through Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who popularized Kant and Schelling in England, and Thomas Carlyle, who wrote extensively on Goethe and German thought. Coleridge's 1825 Aids to Reflection introduced Emerson to Kantian distinctions between understanding, which we could call empirical reasoning, and reason, the intuitive grasp of universal truths, what Laruelle calls knowing without knowing, a theme central to Transcendentalism. In essays like the 1841 The Transcendentalist, Emerson directly cites Kant's intellectual philosophy as the idea of reason as the highest faculty. He praises Schelling's nature philosophy of nature, in his journals, aligning with his own belief in nature as a manifestation of divine spirit. Emerson reinterpreted German idealism poetically. Again, his concept of the oversoul, a divine universal mind, echoes Hegel's idea of Geist, or absolute spirit, and Schelling's world soul. Bronson Alcott, again, leader of the Fruitlands utopian socialist commune, educator and philosopher, read German idealists like Fichte and Schelling via translations and summaries. His Orphic sayings, published in the journal The Dial from 1840 to 1844, reflect Schelling's emphasis on the unity of nature and spirit. Alcott corresponded with British Hegelian James Hutchinson Sterling and hosted a conversation club where they discussed Hegel's ideas and debated them. But his grasp of Hegelian dialectics was idiosyncratic and mystical, which we love. And maybe we'll talk more about Alcott's ideas one day. Another transcendentalist and also journalist and feminist suffragist, Margaret Fuller. She was actually fluent in German, and she translated Goethe and critiqued German literature and philosophy in her essays. In her 1845 Woman in the 19th Century, she wove Hegelian ideas of dialectical progress, the expression of the Geist, in her arguments for gender equality. So some key themes that Transcendentalists borrowed from German idealism were reason versus understanding. Transcendentalists adopted Kant's distinction, privileging intuitive reason over empirical understanding. The unity of spirit and nature. Schelling's fusion of mind and matter resonated in Emerson's 1836 work, Nature. And the idea of historical progress. This also aligns with what's called a Whig view of history, or a Whig progressive view. Hegel's teleological view of history as spirit's self-realization influenced Transcendentalism's optimism about human and social evolution. But next we'll get into the precursors of German idealism, Kant and Swedenborg, and how their ideas led to some of Hegel's ideas and New Thought and Transcendentalism and some later ideas.
Yes. Now I'm in the presence of good spirits, and they have revealed to me many wondrous things.
Perhaps you would find peace if you were to attend our church services more regularly.
Perhaps. But I find no peace in church on account of the spirits who contradict much of what the minister says.
The principal conception in Swedenborg's phantasm is the following. Corporeal beings have no substance of their own, but exist only through the spirit world. Not, however, that each body exists through one spirit, but through all taken together. For that reason, the knowledge of material things has a double significance, an external meaning in regard to the interrelations of matter, an internal meaning insofar as material effects indicate the powers of the spirit world which cause them. Thus the parts in the body of man stand in relation to each other according to material laws. But insofar as the body is preserved by the spirit living in it, its various members and their functions are of value in indicating those powers of the soul, by the operation of which they have their form, activity, and stability. This inner meaning is unknown to man, and it is that which Swedenborg, whose interiors are opened, wants to make known to the world. With all other things of the visible world, the case is the same. They have, as I say, a signification as things, which amounts to little, and another as signs, which amounts to much. This also is the origin of all the new interpretations which he would make of the Scripture. For this inner meaning, the internal sense, that is, the symbolic relation of all things told there to the spirit world, is, as he fancies, the kernel of its value, the rest only the shell. Again, the important point in this symbolic conjunction of corporeal things as images with the interior spiritual state is the following. All spirits present themselves to each other under the appearance of figures possessing extent, and the influences of all these spiritual beings among each other at the same time call forth the appearance of still other spiritual creatures possessing extent, thus, as it were, the appearance of a material world. The scenes of this world, however, are only symbols of its inner state. Nevertheless, they cause such a clear and enduring deception of the senses as to equal the real sensation of such objects. A future interpreter will conclude from this that Swedenborg was an idealist, because he denies to this world its independent subsistence, and therefore held it to be only a systematic appearance arising from the constitution of the spirit world. Thus he talks about the gardens, vast countries, the dwelling places, galleries, and arcades of the spirits, which he claims to see with his own eyes in the clearest light. And he assures us that, having spoken after their death with all his friends, he had nearly always found that those having died recently could persuade themselves with difficulty that they had died, because they beheld a similar world. Also that societies of spirits of the same inner state live in the same appearance in regard to the country and other things there, and that a change of state is accompanied by the appearance of a change of locality. The mass of wild and unspeakably absurd forms and figures which our dreamer believes to see quite clearly in his daily intercourse with spirits must be derived from the fact that, whenever spirits communicate their thoughts to the souls of men, these thoughts take the appearance of material things which, however, present themselves to the subject only on the strength of their relation to an inner meaning, but still with all the appearance of reality. I have already stated that, according to our author, the many powers and qualities of the soul are in sympathy with those organs of the body which they govern. The whole outer man therefore corresponds to the whole inner man. If then a perceptible spiritual influx from the invisible world flows mainly into some one of the powers of the soul, he harmoniously feels its apparent presence also in the corresponding member of his outer man. Under this head he classifies a great variety of sensations in his body, which he claims are always connected with spiritual contemplation.
Well, since we are implanted in the divine, we can never die, for we are in what is eternal and infinite. So far as you approach and draw near to God, doing so entirely as if of your own accord, so far does God approach and draw near to you, and becomes one with you in your inmost being. One of Swedenborg's spiritual insights concerns the nature of angels. He saw their powerful, loving energy radiating as colorful emanations, perhaps the reason they are often pictured with wings. In fact, he says that God intends each one of us to one day become an angel.
As set forth by Kant, is diametrically opposed to the philosophic view that holds that all knowledge arises with sensation and experience. A priori knowledge is the term that is used philosophically. In other words, the transcendental approach was the attempt to bridge the worlds of religion and science, to kind of heal this rift that was created, as we pointed out a couple of weeks ago, when the church, in its attempt to stamp out analytical intellectualism, created this great breach between science and religion. Kant had a desire to kind of bring back this wholeness again. Now, the transcendentalist was usually a sublimated theist, which simply means that he had some strong roots in religion, in the awareness of God, the awareness of certain spiritual ideals. Emerson was originally a minister. Kant studied for the ministry and did some preaching in his early years. However, he was first of all a philosopher, and so he believed in no devil, no evil, no hell, no dualism of any kind, no spiritual authority, no savior, no church, which would certainly qualify him for the appellation of atheist in terms of most folks. But there was a deep spiritual focus in his thinking, though it doesn't always come through, as I say, if you read Kant, because it's very abstruse. In a time when the materialistic concept of man was prevalent, Kant introduced the idea of intuition. In other words, the idea that man could not be explained in terms of determinism, and that his knowledge did not all arise from sensation and experience. He used a simple illustration, an arithmetic equation such as 7 plus 5 equals 12. Now, we know this is true, but how do you know it's true? And I think most of us would stop and think about it, and we'd have to admit that we know it's true because somebody once told us 7 plus 5 equals 12, or we studied the multiplication table and we memorized it. And so we know it. So the point is, do we know it merely as a result of knowing the meanings of words used in the equation? Now, Kant argued, in the typical way the philosopher approaches things, that we cannot know the truth of the equation merely by knowing the definitions or the meanings of the words which are employed in it. For neither the meaning of the word 7, and after all it is a word, even though it indicates units of 7, we can't know it by the meaning of the word 7, nor that of the word plus, or that of the word 5, nor that of the combination of all three words. None of them contains or implies the meaning of the word 12. Now, that's a typical philosophic way of getting at things. So he said that in order to know that 7 plus 5 equal 12, there must be a special power in the mind that does not consist in merely understanding the meaning of words. And to him, this implied the action of what we call intuition. Now, we might think of intuition as being revealed in much clearer ways. But out of this concept of the spiritual open-endedness of man as a thinking creature came a series of works phrased in a dreadful jargon of technical terms famous for their near intelligibility to scholars. But to Kant, there were two worlds. Not the old this world and the world beyond of orthodoxy, but rather he refers to the concept of a spiritual dimension in which reality exists. Now, this, I think, has distinct bearing upon one of the fundamentals, and a very strong fundamental, in truth or metaphysics. The world that we see and describe is the world of space-time. It is the world to which science applies itself. And this space-time world is not reality, it is only appearance. Now, this concept we find very strong in Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science, and we find it through much of the metaphysical teachings. The things of the world are forms in which we perceive and conceive things. They are the forms which we impose on things by virtue of the structure of our own minds. In other words, a stone is a stone because we think it is a stone, and because we see it in this way, and because we apply the name stone to what we see. Now he says that man wears blue glasses, and so everything he sees is blue. He sees things in a certain way, and so the world of appearance is the result of the peculiarity of his thinking. In other words, the world of appearance is the blue world that he sees through the blue glasses. But he says there's a reality behind all of this, and this is revealed when he takes off his glasses. It's not a matter of looking into something beyond, but it's a matter of seeing clearly. Paul says we see in a mirror darkly, but then we see face to face, you see. Now Kant says we can never know reality. He says it's unknowable. To define it is to limit it. The glasses are simply a part of our human makeup, and yet we cannot understand life or the universe unless we know that there is something more, unless we know that there's something more than the blue world that we see when we look through blue glasses. Now, actually, this, I think, is more simply expressed in Jesus' parable, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now, what is suggested here, and this is why I think Kant seems to make a point of the fact that you can never know reality any more than you can know God, or that you can know truth, or that you can know the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. And that is that this is not something that you go somewhere to see, nor is it actually something that you unearth within things, but it is a perspective from which we see. In other words, we see from the consciousness of reality, and then we see clearly face to face. It's an act of faith, it's an expanded awareness, whereas suddenly, instead of seeing, in the sense of Jesus, instead of seeing the lame person, we see the person whole, and we say, "Get up and walk," you see. And this then is a very fundamental aspect of this teaching, I think. But I think the thing that is implied here, and a very interesting and a very important observation that we don't lose sight of, is that much of our development in consciousness should be toward developing not a series of definitions of metaphysical terms, which is so often where the student applies himself, but the development of a perception from which we can see and see the same things that we deal with in everyday life, but see them in a different way. As I say so often, man's not in the world to set it right, but to see it right. And right seeing is the passport from the earthly experience to the heaven of accomplishment. The scientist sees appearances. The transcendentalist sees reality, looking at the same world. One sees from a perspective of depth.
But before we get to Hegel, a couple decades before, Kant and Swedenborg set the stage for Hegel's dialectics. In Kant's 1781 critique of pure reason, he said, "We only know appearances, not ultimate reality," prefiguring the idea of absolute spirit. Swedenborg claimed that he had direct spirit access. This was a disagreement between the two. Now, while Kant admired Swedenborg's visions, he called them unprovable. Hegel took Kant's idea of unknowable reality and Swedenborg's spirit world and fused them together in his dialectic. The result then was a roadmap where spirit evolved through human struggle, not escaping the world, but transfiguring it. Kant sympathized with Swedenborg's vision of spiritual reality and human dualism, but rejected his methodology as unscientific. By subjecting mysticism to critical scrutiny, Kant transformed it into a practical moral framework, laying groundwork for his transcendental idealism. According to scholar Stephen Palmquist in his work on Immanuel Kant, he argues that Kant's engagement with Emanuel Swedenborg's mystical writings was crucial in the development of Kant's own critical philosophy. Specifically, Palmquist suggests that Kant's dreams of a spirit seeker is not just a critique of Swedenborg, but also a place where Kant begins to formulate his critical method by exploring the relationship between reason and mystical experience. So Kant's 1766 Dreams of a Spirit Seeker was where he engages with Swedenborg's ideas, but Palmquist challenges the traditional view that Kant's work on Swedenborg was solely a rejection of his mysticism. He argues that Kant's dreams explore the nature of mystical experiences and their relationship to reason, which ultimately informs Kant's later philosophical project. Palmquist suggests that Kant's engagement with Swedenborg's ideas, particularly his mystical visions, was a catalyst for developing Kant's critical method. This method involves examining the limits of human reason and can be seen emerging from Kant's reflections on Swedenborg. Palmquist contends that Kant's engagement with Swedenborg goes beyond just simple critique, but that he saw value in Swedenborg's work and sought to understand its implications for philosophy. Palmquist proposes the concept of critical mysticism, which suggests that Kant's philosophy and its critical approach can be seen as engaging with mystical experiences and their potential to deepen awareness or of conscience. Palmquist writes that to be mystical in a critical sense, therefore, is to allow our reason to strip away the clothing of bias and private interests that tends to masquerade as knowledge and goodness, in order to bathe oneself in the pure light of wholeness that shines forth from this distinctly human faculty. Now, some core disagreements between Kant and Swedenborg include the idea of theoretical knowledge versus practical faith. Swedenborg claimed direct, knowable access to the spirit world via his visions, while Kant rejected this as theoretically unprovable. While spiritual realities might exist, they lie beyond the limits of possible experience. Such beliefs belong to practical faith, not to knowledge. Another disagreement was their methodology. Swedenborg presented mystical experiences as metaphysical truths, while Kant dismissed this as fanatical sensation dreaming akin to speculative metaphysics. True philosophy must establish boundaries for reason. However, we might be able to see a synthesis between the two. While Swedenborg's claims are theoretically undemonstrable, philosophy cannot prove or disprove spirits, and mystical proofs, in Kant's estimation, fail scientific scrutiny. Swedenborg's insights, though, do hold practical values as metaphors for morality. The immaterial world becomes a regulative idea guiding ethical life, a moral faith rooted in common human experience. Kant's work in Dreams pioneered his mature Copernican method, where theoretical reason is limited to phenomena or nature. Practical reason opens space for nominal reality, such as spirit, as moral postulates. Therefore, Kant refined through his critical mysticism, Swedenborg's mysticism, into a critical philosophy, preserving its ethical core while rejecting its epistemological claims. Kant sympathized with Swedenborg's vision of spiritual reality and human dualism, but rejected his methodology. His ambivalent engagement with Swedenborg ultimately reshaped mysticism into a practical moral framework, one that located spiritual truth in faith rather than empirical knowledge. This critical mysticism, to use Palmquist's term, became a bridge between Enlightenment rigor and transcendental aspiration. A similar synthesis of reason and intuition animated the 19th century spiritualist movements that followed. Again, John Murray Spear, who I've written about, he, much like Swedenborg, engaged with spirits, with spirit guides, one of whom was even Swedenborg, the ghost of Swedenborg himself. And these spirit guides envisioned a new era of truth, one that moved beyond the angular dogmas of the past, which they saw as sort of cutting off humanity from their true potential, towards a more circular unity of knowledge, mirroring Kant's project of reconciling empirical limits with transcendent possibilities. Also prefiguring, again, or well, not prefiguring because it was at the same time, but harmonizing with Hegel's idea of the triad and the antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which we'll get to, which wasn't exactly Hegel's triad, but we'll talk about it in a minute. John Murray's spirit guides said through him, the eras of the past have only to a limited extent satisfied man's expanding material wants. They have been unable fully to fill vacuums because they were angular in their unfoldings and of necessity have created mental angularities. The new era, deriving instruction from the past, the present, and the future, will develop truth in its completeness or circularity. Consequently, its primitive lessons have been the formation of circles, and there have been gatherings around the tables of your dwellings. They're talking about seance gatherings. It was not primarily for the mere purpose of listening to unusual sounds that these circles were organized, but it was symbolic of truths which are to be unfolded. So they saw the seance table as symbolic of the circularity of the angel's vision for the earth. This vision found indirect but fertile ground in American transcendentalism also, where Kant's ideas filtered through Coleridge, inspired Emerson's Oversoul, and echoing Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. New Thought then in turn democratized this concept, transforming it into a pragmatic tool for assessing divine mind. Thus, Kant's critique of Swedenborg's mysticism, far from dismissing spirituality, unwittingly seeded a lineage of thought that would culminate in the metaphysical optimism of New Thought and spiritualism, where the circles of Spear's prophecy became the collective pursuit of spiritual and material harmony, akin to the manifestation of spirit through Hegel's spiraling dialectical triad. While Kant dismissed Swedenborg's mystical visions as unverifiable by reason, Hegel would take metaphysics in a radically different direction. Building on yet transforming Kant's ideas, he argued that reality unfolds through a dynamic process of dialectical reasoning where spirit progressively reveals itself. The bold evolutionary view of the divine and the cosmos would later inspire New Thought and other movements that embraced Hegel's optimism about the mind's power to shape reality. So if Kant sought to limit metaphysics to the bounds of reason, Hegel expanded them, laying the philosophical groundwork for a spirituality that saw thought itself as a divine creative force.
Here, in the phenomenology of Geist, is first of all a phenomenology. Remember, when we, or you can look forward to Husserl, the idea of a phenomenology means that appearance is reality. In other words, the world as we experience it is what it is. There's no ding on sich. There's no second level that we can't get access to. What this podium seems to be is exactly what this podium is. What human history on the development of the human psyche is the human psyche itself. There's nothing underneath or apart or separate from. The world is what it is, and if we look at it rationally, it will disclose itself rationally to us. This is why. Think about it. If the world is mind, or if reality is mind, or if reality is Geist, then naturally, since the content of mind or Geist is rationality, what could the world be but a rational process, assuming that it's temporal and dynamic and changes over time? So this is what the apparently very obscure and implausible proposition that the world is a rational process, that's what it means. In other words, the world is the development of mind, and which means that mind is temporalized. What the phenomenology then turns out to be is a record or an interpretation or an analysis of the coming to be of the appearance of knowledge, the development of knowledge over time. So it's a philosophy of history, but it's also a kind of speculative psychology, a sort of philosophical psychology. In other words, Hegel constantly, first of all, don't try this at home. In other words, if you are intending to read Hegel, I think that this is about the last thing you should read. Not because it isn't a wonderful book, but because you just won't make any sense out of it as a beginning student of philosophy. After you've read all the other books that get covered in the course, then you may want to come back to Hegel, and then you'll have a very good time with it. But you'll find it very daunting and difficult if you try it first up. The reason why is that Hegel is arguably the best read guy that I cover in the course of the history of philosophy. In other words, he has an amazing encyclopedic mind. He is fluent in almost all disciplines, and when he is wrong, he is grandly wrong, but he has a magnificent mind, and there are very few people that, in addition to having great intellectual gifts, are as learned and as well read as Hegel. The elusiveness of his book, the many allusions that he makes in passing, which he expects us to know, is one of the things that impede us from understanding the phenomenology. He's referring to just about everything in creation. Since he knows the entire history of Western philosophy and is well versed in Western art and Western religion and the whole kind of culture of the West, what he does then is look at these phases of culture historically and say to himself, what kind of spirit would hold such a belief as that? And how long would they hold it for? And why would they hold it? And why would they give it up? In other words, is it really arbitrary and contingent? Is it a random set of changes that the history of philosophy undergoes? Or is there something unifying it, something that holds it together? And Hegel says, yes, that is exactly what it is. The whole history of philosophy is the coming to self-knowledge of the Geist. And it comes to this knowledge starting with just the external world and its own understanding and comprehension of that world, and moves in a gradual dialectical progression, generating contradictions and generating impasses. And these contradictions and impasses turn out to be fruitful because by creating an impasse, they ratchet consciousness up, ratchet the Geist up into its next level. The finitude and limitation of human self-consciousness or human self-understanding gradually progresses through the process of contradiction to ever higher levels. And the end, the telos, the purpose of these cogitations is to come to complete, uncontradictory, and absolute final self-consciousness. This can be viewed as the reconciliation of God and man, or the reconciliation of human beings with themselves, depending on what sort of a reading, the right wing or the left wing reading you're going to give it. I'll discuss that a little bit later. But the idea here is that Hegel is describing the spiritual odyssey of Western man. And because Hegel believes that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, he is also talking about his own spiritual odyssey from an early, naive, pre-philosophical view to the position he finds himself in at the end of his life, where he believes, perhaps mistakenly, that the entire history of Western thought leads up to him and his writing desk. There's a line, I believe it's in the encyclopedia, where he says, my pen is writing the thoughts of God. Well, it's not so far-fetched, since after all, the Geist is becoming self-conscious, and the cutting edge of time is right here and now, and it turns out to be him. So one of the difficulties of all philosophers of history is that they necessarily view the world as if it led up to them. Where else could it lead? All right? So that's one of the difficulties, the kind of tendency towards omniscience that we see in Hegel. It's built into this kind of a project about the history of philosophy. You could read the phenomenology of Geist as being what the Germans called a Bildungsroman, a novel of development or a novel of maturation. This is the way the big collective subject, the big person, the big mind, the big Geist, turns into what it necessarily had to be. Built into Hegel's conception is the Aristotelian idea of entelechy. Entelechy means natural purpose. Acorns naturally want to be oaks. Right? Babies naturally want to be adults. The Geist naturally wants to be completely omniscient, completely self-conscious. And since it generates the entire world, when it is completely conscious of itself, it is completely conscious of everything that it can be conscious of. It is essentially divine. It is the mind of God. So you can see the echoes of that early religious training here in this longing for final knowledge, in this desire for God's omniscience. And Hegel, alas, couches this in very difficult prose, but many of the ideas are quite subtle and well thought out. And if you can hack your way through this book, you will find it extremely...
In our last lecture, I ended the history of ethics in a way, what would be a usual introduction to ethics course, by discussing Hegel's view of ethics with its, what one might call its super concept of freedom. The very large concept of freedom as formulating those goals and desires of individuals in whatever given historical period. And the idea that freedom represents is to see those goals and obstacles and their overcoming in that period, and to name that activity and those sets of practices freedom. Now, that side of Hegel's philosophy, and Hegel is perhaps the most important philosopher in the 19th century, because the people that I will talk about today, at least the first two or three, react against Hegel. So Hegel's view is very important, but the Hegel I gave you the other day is a very radical Hegel, where freedom is the central notion. But there's another side to Hegel, as many of you may have suspected if you've looked at articles like Fukuyama's The End of History, something like that. There's another side of Hegel, a more conservative side, that argues that while his view remains historical, that history is, as it were, the context within which all activities, truth, and so on gets its meaning, in which human beings become what he calls spirit. The conservative Hegel, that reading of Hegel, he argues that the culmination of this long historical process is something like the Prussian state, or on an updated reading like Fukuyama's, and this is one that I think it perfectly fits what George Bush means by the New World Order. It means that history proper is at an end. This is a very strange notion, because we still, I think, to some extent think historically. History proper is at an end because the human race has found the right ideas, namely liberal democracy, by which we mean the televised pseudo-state, to try to speak, and VCRs. Once you have an economy that produces VCRs and stuff, and a pseudo-state that gives you the satisfaction of lording it over the rest of the planet with a social system that doesn't work, history's reached its end, and there are no more battles over big ideas. That's the point. That as long as the Cold War was going on, there were ideologies and battles between them, socialism, capitalism, and so on. But with the end of the Cold War, this is the updated version of Hegel's argument. Well, now that's interesting already, because it needed to be updated. See, since Hegel thought it was over in the 19th century, this more recent article argues that history ended in the 20th century, only to have the Gulf War come along. And if there's one sure sign in Hegel's philosophy that history isn't over, of course it's a war, because they're embodied people in struggle with different views about what freedom is and how to live. So now there'll have to be another update about it being over. So I'm very skeptical about that claim, and also the conservative Hegel, for other reasons, would not be my favorite. In any case, reacting to the philosophy of Hegel were a whole set of intellectuals, and he has an ambiguous legacy. There were right-wing Hegelians and left-wing Hegelians. In fact, one of the origins of right-wing, left-wing was not simply where people sat in a French theater, although that's another origin of the word. One has to do with these two schools of readings of Hegel. The right-wing Hegelians took Hegel to be fundamentally right, and their only task was to apply his method of investigation to subject after subject. In other words, just investigate the Prussian state, spell out explicitly what he hadn't quite said enough of, said enough about. The other school of Hegelians were the left-wing Hegelians, one of whom later became very famous, and he will be the first person I'll discuss today as we move beyond what I consider to be rather narrow ethical concerns. while the problems we discussed in the last few lectures I consider important, they are much narrower concerns than the best kind of social arrangements within which human beings can realize their character and so on. And those lead to a whole larger set of issues. So those are the ones we'll discuss today. Those are the ones that were raised by Hegel under the word freedom. And as I say, the most famous left-wing Hegelian to take up the challenge of giving a richer concept of freedom, I've already mentioned, was Karl Marx. Marx's name, of course, is not used much anymore. You know, I mean, this is supposed to be what happened in the last 15 years, is that definitively his view of the world has been refuted, and so on. And I would like to warn against these relatively premature judgments, especially in the long scope of history. After all, communism is an ideology. In the Soviet Union, the first communist state, began in 1917, and it is hardly a long historical run to go from 1917 to 1989 and to win hearts and minds in 2/3 of the world, and then and be over like that. That is the kind of historical view a culture might have if that culture's view of history was based on mini-series, because then you could go, well, that was kind of like a mini-series in this longer story. But as a matter of just historical fact, the text of Marx is a classic text. William Bennett agrees it's a classic. It's in the great books, so there you go. It's a classic, okay? No more argument needed, right? Bennett, you know, Bush's Hash's man, says it's a classic, so it's a classic. And then in the historical sense, it's still an ambiguous legacy, because throughout the history of Marxism, based on this Hegelian mode of thought in which concepts change as people change, there was an ongoing criticism, which, as we know today in Eastern Europe, has led to the overthrow of certain governments, an ongoing criticism within the communist states of communism. That didn't appear obvious to us over here until these dramatic events, as though they hadn't been prepared for by a long historical process of criticism. Of course, we were blinded to that on our side of the border for Orwellian reasons, for strictly Orwellian reasons. But now we see, by this period of history, we see that there were quite important social movements, movements that do deserve the name democratic movements, in a way that very few movements in this country deserve the name. I mean, a movement that serious as for democracy in the United States would have to be either associated with dangerous African Americans with strange ideas that have made bizarre off-the-record remarks or something, or else in some other way ghettoized. Real movements for democracy are, oddly enough, most threatening in nominal democracies. That's a principle of Hegelian discourse. In other words, if you live by an ideology, the most dangerous ideology to you is your own, because someone may expect you to do what you say. So,
but what was Hegel's philosophy? What was his philosophy of the phenomenology of the spirit, first published in 1807? He says in the famous preface to that work, "Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born. So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of the previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted by isolated symptoms. The frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change. The gradual crumbling that left unaltered the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which, in one flash, illuminates the features of the new world." So even though Hegel was a conservative, we can see some hopefulness for our world in his writings. You can see why he influenced Marx so much. Now, as I mentioned, Hegel was a monist, which means he believed in one ultimate reality or absolute spirit. a single divine presence and power governing reality, monism. While this concept generally aligns with New Thought philosophy, it does raise a difficult question of evil's origin. And we talked about that in more depth last time, but Hegel has a good answer too. Again, to restate the problem of evil, if only one supreme power exists, did God create evil? Attributing evil to God suggests cruelty, while claiming God did not create it fails to prevent it implies that God is weak or indifferent. This challenge of reconciling God's goodness with power with evil's existence is known as theodicy. This is an old question in theology. New Thought philosophy defines evil as merely the absence of good. We've talked about this more last time. H. Emily Cady said, "Evil does not exist. Apparent evils are not entities or things of themselves. They're simply apparent absence of good, just as darkness is an absence of light." However, this explanation feels inadequate to those experiencing profound suffering, whether from oppression, exploitation, disease, violence, or impoverishment. You're sort of blaming people for the suffering that they're undergoing. But Hegel went deeper. For him, evil is not an illusion, it's a necessary force in the cosmic dance. A spiraling dance, again, recalling John Murray Spears' Spirit Guide's formulation of it. Hegel termed this transformative process the triad. It posits that spirit, God's historical realization, is not given, but generated through the interaction of the divine idea, God's rational blueprint for perfection, and nature, the concrete empirical world existing in space and time, which manifests limitations and conflicts, which again are interpreted as evil or in opposition to the divine idea. So spirit synthesizes these opposing forces through a process like this. First, there's the thesis, and we can think of this in Hegel's triad as God's perfect blueprint, the idea, capital I. Then there's the antithesis. The antithesis of idea for Hegel is nature, the chaotic fallen world where evil exists. And then the synthesis of these two is spirit, where humanity transforms suffering into freedom. Now, I'm doing a little bit of post-Hegelian extrapolation there. While the famous thesis, antithesis, synthesis model is often attributed to Hegel, called the Hegelian Dialectic, scholars, including like Walter Kaufmann, the philosopher, argue that this is a misinterpretation. Kaufmann notes that searching in Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit for this stereotype yields nothing. Instead, what one finds is, according to Kaufmann, a very decided preference for triadic arrangements that are not presented as so many theses, antitheses, and syntheses. 19th century Hegelian Moritz Chalbaus, 19th century, this is a hard name to pronounce, 19th century Hegelian Heinrich Moritz Chalbaus is usually credited with being the first to identify Hegel's dialectic as the triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But the Chalabausian dialectic doesn't sound as good as the Hegelian dialectic. For Hegel, suffering and nothingness, like evil in nature, are real forces inherent in existence, contrasting with the divine idea, or God's perfect will. Hegel argues that the clash between suffering or nature and the divine idea or spirit creates an opportunity for becoming, for humanity to actively transform tragedy into a greater reality, which he calls freedom. Our true power, therefore, lies not in preventing all evil, but in our limitless potential to forge greater good from it, from the synthesis. This transformative process is Hegel's triad. Again, where spirit or God, realized through history, emerges from the synthesizing of the divine idea and nature. This mirrors New Thought traditions such as Unity's idea of Christ within, or the indwelling Christ, your divine spark that turns chaos into freedom. Hegel's genius was that he showed that spirit needs humanity to realize itself. You are not a victim of life, therefore, you are indeed the glue in God's plan. So here's some more ways that Hegel's dialectic, which we'll just use the shorthand as the Hegelian dialectic, aligns with New Thought and Unity's perspective on God as absolute reality versus relative reality. So for Hegel, the idea or the thesis is a pure, universal, abstract reason of divine mind. Fundamental, eternal, and absolute reality. It's God in his most transparent aspect. This corresponds perfectly to the concept of God as absolute reality in New Thought, the one mind, divine principle, infinite intelligence, unchanging, perfect, and source of all. It is the unconditioned, eternal truth. Also, the idea of relative reality, which Hegel calls antithesis, in his, doesn't use the term antithesis, but calls nature, in fact, in his triad, or material world. Again, this is antithesis of the idea, the unity, the thesis, God. So I said spirit earlier. I should say God is the absolute idea. But again, this aligns with the idea in New Thought of relative reality, that the world of form, change, limitation, and sensory experience is a realm where the absolute appears diversified, subject to laws, divine laws like cause and effect, and where illusion or separation from the divine can seem real. And that's where we get a lot of problems, is when we are separated from God. Nature, then, is the absolute expressing as form. Again, as Katie says, the Father God, Mother God is the Father God is pressed out as Mother God. That's what she says. And then the synthesis is in spirit and humanity. The spirit is the conscious union of these two. According to Hegel, the spirit is the synthesis or the return of the idea to itself through nature, achieving self-consciousness. Humans, then, are the specific point where spirit and nature unite. Here, the universal idea becomes conscious in and through humanity, who, working purposefully toward freedom, create history. Again, we're the glue in God's plan, according to Hegel. This resonates profoundly with New Thought, which sees humans as the focal point where absolute reality becomes consciously aware within relative reality. The indwelling Christ, or indwelling spirit in unity, or the I am presence, is the conscious synthesis. Humanity is not separate from God, but a vehicle through which the absolute consciously expresses, creates, and evolves within the relative world. Again, then, our goal is to be the glue or conscious channel between these. Hegel and New Thought also deal with the question of reason versus unconscious law. For Hegel, the idea or reason governs both nature, unconsciously as an immutable law, and history, consciously through spirit expressing in humanity, striving for freedom. This mirrors the distinction between impersonal divine law, unchangeable, operating in the relative world, like gravity or karma, and the conscious activity of God through individualized human consciousness. We're meant to consciously align with and express the absolute, unlike our unconscious nature. For Hegel, his knowledge of the system is presented as a system of knowing as the whole is presented as a result of comprehending the absolute reality, the whole absolute reality, the idea in its full movement. This aligns with the new concept of spiritual insight or revelation, understanding the absolute principle or God through direct inner knowing or realization, which then illuminates the nature of the relative world. It's knowing God first, from which all else is understood. So, what does this 19th century German philosopher mean for you and your spiritual practice? Well, in fact, quite a bit. Hegel's idea becoming nature is the law of attraction. Your thoughts shape reality. Hegel saw history as spirit's march toward freedom. For New Thought, that's synthesis in action. Hegel gives us permission to say pain is real, but so is your power to rebirth it into meaning. Unlike Kant's passive, unknowable God, Hegel's spirit or Geist is alive in you. When you pray, I'm one with God, you're channeling Hegel's synthesis. So in conclusion, Hegel taught us that God is not finished. He's realizing himself through you. In every challenge, ask yourself, how can I be the glue between the divine idea and a broken world? That's New Thought's secret Hegelian superpower. The profound insights of German idealism, especially Hegel's Dialectic, need not remain abstract philosophy. When woven with New Thought principles, they form a powerful framework for conscious transformative living. When facing adversity, recognize it not as a meaningless absence of good, as pure New Thought might frame it, nor as a final reality, but as the necessary friction point for growth. Consciously engage your divine idea, or antithesis, or engage your thesis, divine idea, your highest attention, vision, or rational purpose, and actively work to synthesize it into greater understanding, resilience, or creative action in nature and express a spirit. An example might be in nature, you experience a career setback, but you have a divine idea of your vision for purposeful work. And so your expression of the Geist of the spirit might be the motivation to upskill or to pivot to a different career. Socially, every societal contradiction, poverty, oppression, alienation, is not accidental, but a dialectical tension between God as thesis and nature as antithesis, which demands resolution. The Christian socialist vision of a just communal society must engage with these material realities and not deny them. The synthesis then might be organized action in labor movements, mutual aid, and political advocacy that turns struggle into structural change. And again, an example might be in nature, you experience economic exploitation. The divine idea is, such as in Deuteronomy 15:4, the biblical call for no poor among you. So then the spirit expressed is worker cooperatives, unionization, communitarianism, wealth redistribution. New Thought also rightly emphasizes the power of consciousness, and Hegel adds depth to this. True power lies not in attracting desired outcomes, but in transforming obstacles into catalysts. Ask yourself then, how can this friction refine my purpose? What greater good might emerge through my response? This shifts focus from passive positive thinking to active meaning making, to a dialectical process of pressing out. New Thought focuses on personal abundance. New Thought's focus on personal abundance must expand into collective abundance in the social realm. Hegel teaches us that true power lies not in evading suffering, but in transforming systems that create it, despite his political conservatism. That was the difference between the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians, is they were more revolutionary. But instead of asking, how can I attract prosperity, you might want to ask, how can we do away with limitations and barriers to universal flourishing? Again, you want to balance those denials with affirmation. So affirm, God is my source, God is my wealth, I do not lack. Balance new thoughts, intuitive trust in divine goodness, again, with Hegel's insistence on engaging concrete reality through reason. Analyze situations rationally. Charles Fillmore calls this the power of discernment or judgment, which is a little bit different than the power of wisdom. Wisdom is more like unlearned knowing, whereas discernment is learned knowing. So analyze systems rationally while holding an ultimate vision of growth and unity. Avoid spiritual bypassing. Or what is called spiritual bypassing is called pretending. Is when you pretend justice is just an illusion. Oh, this whole world is just an illusion. Simulation theories, things like that. This only upholds suppression. Hegel insists that we confront reality with critical reason. So while New Thought reminds us of the divine spark in all people, we need to also balance it with critical reason. So together they demand material analysis, acknowledging exploitation, plus radical love of the kingdom of God, a divine vision of a political reality, and the synthesis is a faith that works for justice. You can also co-create spirit and history personally. You can see your life as a microcosm of Hegel's grand narrative. Your struggles and choices contribute to the unfolding realization of spirit, understood practically as greater wisdom, freedom, and wholeness in your personal history. You are an agent in this synthesis. It's also the people's struggle for freedom. Your choices, where you spend, how you labor, who you organize with, are part of this unfolding liberation. Reject simplistic explanations of evil. Instead, acknowledge suffering's reality while wielding your unlimited capacity to transform it, as Katie suggests, through conscious integration and purposeful action. Hope is not denial, it's the active choice to forge meaning. Christianity demands abolition of suffering. It does not glorify it. Hegel shows us that pain is not an endpoint, but a provocation to a synthesis. The early church understood this when they practiced all things in common, as it says in Acts 4:32, as a model for economic justice today. New Thought anchors us in the divine truth of human dignity. Hegel equips us to fight for its realization. This dialectic is not just a thought experiment, it's a spiritual and political mandate to engage the world as it is and to remake it as it should be. Use New Thought to anchor yourself in the ultimate reality of good. Use Hegel to navigate the messy, often painful dialectic of life, knowing that your conscious engagement is the alchemy that births personal and collective freedom, the spirit. Your practical power lies in this sacred synthesis, transforming the raw material of experience into wisdom through relentless, loving reason. The kingdom of God is not just within you, it's between us, in the structures we build, the justice we demand, and the love that refuses to accept oppression as is inevitable. Brothers and sisters, we are not mere spectators of history, we are its co-creators. The fires of dialectics burn in every unjust system, in every cry for bread and dignity, in every heart that refuses to accept the world as it is. This is our holy task to take up the tools of reason and revelation, to marry spirit and action, and to become midwives of a new reality. Let us go forth with clear eyes and defiant hope. Where the world says, this is just how things are, we will say, no, this is how things could be. Where the powerful preach scarcity, we organize to build abundance. Where suffering is called inevitable, we build alternatives. We serve a God who turns crosses into resurrections, who makes a way out of no way, and who commands us to do likewise. The dialectic of heaven is not passive. It's a movement, a struggle, and a great divine work in which we're all called to take part. So let us move together towards the synthesis, not in theory, but in living, breathing solidarity. The spirit is not done. The revolution is not over. The kingdom is still coming. A new world struggles to be born. The dialectic is ever alive, and the spirit is being pressed out. Will you be part of its next movement?
And again, why not? Well, because in the current situation, as many events that have just happened, I think indicate political power and economic power are deeply interlocked. It seems to me hardly accidental that most of the people in the Senate are millionaires. I think all but what, one or two? They're all millionaires. Is that just an accident? An accidental relation? Most of them white guys, notice that? Accidental relation? No. See, that's the kind of prima facie evidence one should look at. You should go, well, that just looks like a bunch of white guys at some really rich club in New York. Well, it is like them. In fact, when they go to New York, it is them. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory because all of them appear on TV and tell you they're running your lives. So it's not a conspiracy. The deep insight Marx has, and it's really an important one, is that whatever, and by the way, this is not a sufficient condition for what we would like to call a good or excellent human life, but it's a necessary condition. Necessary but not sufficient, is that you not have your life reduced to total poverty. That's this, in other words, it's not enough to just be free from constraints. You can't be just reduced to penury and then say that that person has a free life. And on the other hand, you can't have your life reduced to work, no matter how high the wage, and have it be a really excellent life. That reduction of life to work itself cripples life and cripples the challenge to become something else, larger, other. And it's only in that sense that we started with these philosophical ideals, because each one of them points the way it projects other than, right? Other than simply being the person who sold the most tires, who pushed the most papers through the largest office. Each one of them. In that regard, let me refer back to a really old one.
Which is its discord and pain, and mirroring itself in its own essence. The state of feeling in question we find expressed most purely and beautifully in the Psalms of David and in the prophets, the chief burden of whose utterances is the thirst of the soul after God, its profound sorrow for its transgressions, the desire for righteousness and holiness. Of this spirit we have the mythical representation at the very beginning of the Jewish canonical books in the account of the fall. Man, created in the image of God, lost, it is said, his state of absolute contentment by eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Sin consists here only in knowledge. This is the sinful element, and by it man is stated to have trifled away his natural happiness. This is a deep truth, that evil lies in consciousness, for the brutes are neither evil nor good, the merely natural man quite as little. Consciousness occasions the separation of the ego, in its boundless freedom as arbitrary choice, from the pure essence of the will, that is, from the good. Knowledge, as the disannulling of the unity of mere nature, is the fall. which is no casual conception, but the eternal history of spirit. For the state of innocence, the paradisical condition, is that of the brute. Paradise is a park where only brutes, not men, can remain. For the brute is one with God only implicitly, not consciously. Only man's spirit, that is, has a self-cognizant existence. This existence for self, this consciousness, is at the same time separation from the universal and divine spirit. If I hold in my abstract freedom, in contraposition to the good, I adopt the standpoint of evil. The Fall, from the Philosophy of History. The fall is the eternal mythos of man, stating the arrival of man to a deeper consciousness of his true self, his union with the divine human, and his wide separation between his real and his ideal, the necessity for a reconciliation of the two. A further interpretation of the Old Testament doctrine of the fall of man and the history of the chosen people. The fall is, therefore, the eternal mythos of man, in fact, the very transition by which he becomes man. Persistence in this standpoint is, however, evil, and the feeling of pain at such a condition, and of longing to transcend it, we find in David when he says, "Lord, create for me a pure heart, a new, steadfast spirit." This feeling we observe even in the account of the fall, though an announcement of reconciliation is not made there, but whether of continuance in misery. Yet we have in this narrative the prediction of reconciliation in the sentence, "The serpent's head shall be bruised," but still more profoundly expressed where it is stated that when God saw that Adam had eaten of the tree, he said, "Behold, Adam is become as one of us, knowing good and evil." God confirms the words of the serpent. Implicitly and explicitly, then, we have the truth that man, through spirit, through cognition of the universal and the particular, comprehends God himself. But it is only God that declares this, not man. The latter remains, on the contrary, in a state of internal discord. The joy of reconciliation is still distant from humanity. The absolute and final repose of his whole being is not yet discovered to man. It exists, in the first instance, only for God. As far as the present is concerned, the feeling of pain at his condition is regarded as a final award. The satisfaction which man enjoys at first consists in the finite and temporal blessings conferred on the chosen family and the possession of the land of Canaan. His repose is not found in God. Sacrifices are, it is true, offered to him in the temple, and atonement made by outward offerings and inward penitence. But that mundane satisfaction in the chosen family and its possession of Canaan was taken from the Jewish people in the chastisement inflicted by the Roman Empire. The Syrian kings did indeed oppress it, but it was left for the Romans to annul its individuality. The Temple of Zion is destroyed. The God-serving nation is scattered to the winds. Here every source of satisfaction is taken away, and the nation is driven back to the standpoint of that primeval mythos, the standpoint of that painful feeling which humanity experiences when thrown upon itself. Opposed to the universal fatum of the Roman world, we have here the consciousness of evil and the direction of the mind Godwards. All that remains to be done is that this fundamental idea should be expanded to an objective universal sense and be taken as the concrete existence of man, as the completion of his nature. Formerly, the land of Canaan, and themselves as the people of God, had been regarded by the Jews as that concrete and complete existence. But this basis of satisfaction is now lost, and thence arises the sense of misery and failure of hope in God, with whom that happy reality had been essentially connected. Here, then, misery is not the stupid immersion in a blind fate, but a boundless energy of longing. Stoicism taught only that the negative is not. that pain must not be recognized as a veritable existence. But Jewish feeling persists in acknowledging reality and desires harmony and reconciliation within its sphere. For that feeling is based on the Oriental unity of nature, that is, the unity of reality, of subjectivity, with the substance of the one essential being. Through the loss of mere outward reality, spirit is driven back within itself. The side of reality is thus refined to universality through the reference of it to the One. The Atonement, from the Philosophy of History. The Persian idea of good and evil, Ormuzd and Ahriman, is not much deeper than that of light and darkness, but in the Old Testament it becomes the distinction between holiness and sin. Hegel points out the infinite depth of subjectivity, or personal self-realization, that is involved in consciousness of sin. He shows how that unrest of infinite sorrow passes over into a consciousness of the infinite gain of reconciliation with the divine when the fullness of time was come. The Oriental antithesis of light and darkness is transferred to spirit, and the darkness becomes sin. For the abnegation of reality there is no compensation but subjectivity itself, the human will as intrinsically universal, and thereby alone does reconciliation become possible. Sin is the discerning of good and evil as separation, but this discerning likewise heals the ancient hurt and is the fountain of infinite reconciliation. The discerning in question brings with it the destruction of that which is external and alien in consciousness, and is consequently the return of subjectivity into itself. This, then, adopted into the actual self-consciousness of the world, is the reconciliation, atonement, of the world. From that unrest of infinite sorrow, in which the two sides of the antithesis stand related to each other, is developed the unity of God with reality, which latter had been posited as negative, that is, with subjectivity which had been separated from him. The infinite loss is counterbalanced only by its infinity, and thereby becomes infinite gain. The recognition of the identity of the subject and God was introduced into the world when the fullness of time was come. The consciousness of this identity is the recognition of God in his true essence. The material of truth is spirit itself, inherent vital movement. The nature of God as pure spirit is manifested to man in the Christian religion.